started. All right. Boom. What has happened, everybody? Thanks for joining us today. I had an absolute blast with our Dune live stream a few weeks ago, and I'm planning on doing a hell of a lot more of these broadcasts in the future. Just to give you an idea of the format today, we're going to rant and rave for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be opening up the discussion to anyone in the live stream. Super chat donations, which are always appreciated but not required, will get answered first. But today we're going to be talking about the career of James Cameron, in particular his often overlooked 1989 film, The Abyss, a film of soaring ambition that encountered one or two production difficulties along the way. But with James Cameron returning to the water for the first Avatar sequel, due to be released next year, we'll also be making some predictions on that front as well. But joining me today are two gentlemen that I've recorded with many times in the past on my podcast, Wrong Reel. They're filmmakers, they're podcasters, and two of the biggest fanatics for this flick that I know, Adam Rackoff and Bill Scurry. Adam will be leading the charge initially in this conversation, but Bill will be chilling in the chat room, so give him a heads up if you have a great question to ask. But before I start peppering Adam with questions, let's introduce y'all properly. Mr. Rackoff, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, hi, James. Thank you for having me back on your live stream. Yes, I'm a friend of Mr. Hancock's as well as producing partners. We have a small production company called Rackoff Hancock Animated Productions, and we make short films with animator Bill Plimpton. So if you haven't seen any of those works, you can check out Cop Dog on iTunes as well as The Loneliest Stoplight on iTunes. They're both available now. I also have a production company with actor Matthew Modine, who you may know from Full Metal Jacket and Stranger Things. And I'm an artist and a podcaster and a dad and all of a whole lot of different things. So here I am.
Beautiful. Mr. Scurry, what about you?
Well, now with more Scurry, as the graphic was very kind to add. I am Bill Scurry. I'm the founder and proprietor of American Caesar Enterprises. I have a bunch, which is pretty much just a thing, intellectual property thing. It's not really anything. My point is I do podcasts. I write about film. I do a podcast called I Don't Get It, where we look at pop culture trends, usually fixated around the 20-year-old kind of range, and see whether or not we, vibe as 40-year-old men with things that are sold to kids. And I just have a video series. I started pushing out the first episode of it, which is coincidentally about The Abyss.
And it was fucking awesome.
I appreciate that. I've been sitting on it for a long time. I'm glad
there is a link in the description of this show down below if you want to look. It's like 6 minutes long, but it basically does in 6 minutes what we're aiming to do in about 90.
But I love The Abyss, and I think we're all here because I'm here because I want to hear you two guys talk about it. And so I trust that this place is going to go into some nice weird curly cues and some nice undersea ledges and caves and swim throughs. And The Abyss is really worth this kind of discussion. So I can't wait to hear where this goes.
Beautiful. Well, before we get fully underway, Adam, I also want to give you a shout out about your beautiful graphic design work and plugging and promoting this this live stream. So you seem to get a little better with each one that you do. So I'm gonna have to just give you a retainer, like a lifelong retainer, to do all my thumbnails for all my live streams moving forward.
Well, I'm secretly hoping that I can get this in front of, Gail Ann Hurd or James Cameron or somebody over at Fox, and maybe they'll use it on their new Blu-ray box cover artwork.
Yeah, well, we'll be getting to any and all rumors related to the potential 4K or 8K scan of The Abyss, but let's start at the very beginning before we get into the woods on that. Let's just talk about the early days of James Cameron. Like, who was James Cameron? How did he get started? And what had he done in his career to date that even opened the doors to making such a colossal, risky, hellish production like The Abyss even possible?
Well, first I'll just make an admission. Like many, I'm a huge James Cameron fan, and very little that he does has disappointed me over the years. I really just think he's an amazing filmmaker. He's constantly pushing boundaries, mostly technical and visual effects boundaries, and I just think he has a level of perfectionism that is admirable. And a lot of people don't like him as a person. People that work with him don't like him, but that's not entirely true. I think there's plenty of people that have worked with him and in retrospect have said, wow, he got the best work out of me ever.
Like Bill Paxton and guys like that.
Exactly. And that's something. I used to work for Apple. It's something that I can say was very much like working with Steve Jobs. He was somebody that could be a tyrant and could really work you crazy hours, but at the end of the day, you were really proud of what you were a part of and accomplished with him sort of at the helm. So I think that he gets a bad rap at times, but it's, for the most part, it's all in the name of creating his art. You know, he has a goal in mind and a vision in mind, and he'll do whatever it takes to achieve that. And sometimes that means trampling on people who are not doing good work. Sometimes I think that means it's actually affected his marriages, which I believe he's been married 5 times.
It caused most of his marriages.
Yeah, it
Right,
causes and ends his
right.
marriages. It's like Homer Simpson and beer, like, you know, it's the cause of and the cause of and solution to all of life's
Right.
problems.
Exactly. So, but yeah, Cameron was. Let's go back in time a little bit, because there's
Actually, just real quick pause. I just
Yeah.
want to say thank you to Cheryl Yara. She just made a donation in the super chat. She says the theatrical release didn't explain the aliens, and that is 100% true. When I first saw the theatrical release on TV, I was completely, utterly bewildered and left scratching my head. And I was like 13, and I knew I liked the movie, but I could tell something was just off. And it would take me years before I actually finally saw the proper full-length version, which was on Laserdisc with good old Dolby Digital AC3 sound, and that definitely cleared up a lot of things. So we'll definitely be doing the deep dive on the distinctions between the 2 cuts later in the episode, but I did just want to give you a shout out and a thank you for the donation. That's very kind of you. But Adam, go on with the chlorophyll, as Billy Madison would have said.
Yeah, I mean, just if you go back in time a little bit, Cameron was always fascinated by the ocean. In high school, he was witness to some really incredible experiments with breathing, liquid breathing, and this inspired him to sort of start writing short stories. And he even wrote one about a group of underwater a group of scientists working underwater, which is sort of the basis for The Abyss. This was obviously 2 decades prior to actually developing The Abyss. But you know, after he saw Star Wars, first of all, he was a truck driver in the mid-70s. He was a real blue-collar, working-class guy. He then saw Star Wars, like many people, and from that point on, he realized, I have to be in the filmmaking business. Especially, I think he was especially interested in visual effects, and he was trying to learn anything he could about the process of how visual effects were created. He would go to the library and look for thesis papers that were written by students. He would read books. And of course, this all led to him eventually working for Roger Corman, who was essentially the B movie king at the time in the 70s and early 80s for science fiction and horror. And who
launched Jonathan Demme and Scorsese and Bogdanovich and Coppola, and he basically launched an entire generation of the world's, or at least America's, best filmmakers.
Exactly. So this led to obviously an opportunity.
Joe Dante. I know Mr. Cribbs, who's in the chat, would appreciate the Joe Dante shout out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Holy shit! Jacob Rivera just dropped $20 in the super chat. That's very generous. That's incredibly kind. Jacob, who's been listening to Wrong Reel probably longer than most, he's been trying to get me to monetize my content for the longest time. He's probably got more ideas on the front even than I do. So Jacob, you finally had an opportunity to throw some cash toward this content. So much obliged. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, so back to his sort of early career, he worked on a number of those Roger Corman films. Battle Across the Stars, I think it was one of them, where he was a visual effects supervisor. And he was actually working on the sequel to Joe Dante's Piranha 2, The Spawning, when the director left the project over creative differences. And he was essentially offered the opportunity to direct the remainder of the film, which of course
somehow that movie feels like a James Cameron movie. Like if you look at the star, the way she conducts herself, the topic, the water, like it's incredible just how much of like Cameron's DNA is already there in the movie, where he wasn't even originally the director.
Right, and he not only did he pick up after another director left the project, but he was also fired towards the end of the production as well. So that film was fraught with problems from the get-go. But it was sort of the first chance for him to get behind that director's chair and work with actors. Prior to this, he was doing matte paintings and model building and all types of other creative behind-the-scenes work. And this, of course, was his first work that involved the ocean. So it was the beginning of a 40-year career of making movies that were connected to the ocean in some way, shape, or form. Of course, he then went on to write and direct The Terminator in 1984, which leading up to that, he was literally starving, living on a friend's couch in Los Angeles. He tells one story in an interview where he was so poor at the time when he was developing the Terminator before production began that his mother would send him coupons for buy one, get one free Big Macs from McDonald's. He would go to McDonald's, get his free Big Mac. He would eat one that day, have nothing else that day, save the other one for the next day, and that would be his food for 2 days. So
yeah, those don't age well. They don't even age well after like 30 minutes.
Not at all. But when you're determined, this shows again his determination, everything for his art. He wanted to get this film, The Terminator, produced. He wanted to direct it. He had to make sacrifices to do that. He found this production company, Hemdell, and Gail Ann Hurd, of course. This is where he first began his partnership with her.
Yeah, rock star producer.
Exactly. So they were able to team up and make this film, but he was essentially gave away his rights to the Terminator, the sort of franchise rights, in order to get the film made the way he wanted to make it. And it paid off in the sense that he made his movie his way. It was made, I think, for $6.5 million. It went on to make like 90 million at the global box office, which was a huge hit for, I think it was Orion Pictures was the distributor at the time. And then he was pretty much given a huge opportunity to go and make a sequel to Ridley Scott's Alien in 1986 with Aliens. And this film, there are stories that are just as horrid as we're about to discuss with The Abyss. The crew despised Cameron on this movie, partially because they're
loyal to Ridley.
They were really loyal to Ridley, and they didn't quite know what Cameron was going for. He was making this action movie that was really, as I've discussed before, it was really sort of a Vietnam War film in space. It was these, American Marines going into a hostile environment, thinking that they're just going to use the latest technologies and latest weaponry to wipe out the bad guy. And boy, were they in for a surprise when they got there. The guerrilla warfare techniques that the Viet Cong were using is very much analogous to the alien, the animalistic creatures that they were fighting. So this film, of course, Aliens, despite the challenges in getting it made, was a huge hit. He did have to cut some footage from it, about 20 minutes, I believe, to get it down to the length that the studio wanted. But this was nominated for 7 Oscars, which is a huge deal, and won for Best Visual Effects, among others. His first of several 5 visual effects Oscars that his films would win, I believe. And this basically was an opportunity. This created the opportunity for him to do whatever he wanted next. And what he wanted more than anything was to revisit that high school story he wrote about those scientists working at the bottom of the ocean. But of course, he realized after working in Hollywood for a few years now that people weren't going to be as interested in scientists working at the bottom of the ocean. Although that did sort of work with a movie like The Thing, which is similar in a lot of regards. But he decided, let's make them blue collar oil rig workers. That way the audiences will be able to relate to them a little more and feel connected to their, like, what if I was down there at the bottom of the ocean? That could be me.
It worked in Alien. People love watching stories about blue collar skilled labor in these otherworldly environments.
Yeah, you can put yourself in that environment much more easily than if it's some
stately robed people speaking in lofty florid language and that sort of thing.
Exactly. So that and I was talking to Bill Scurry earlier about this, but he first shopped the script around, or at least the treatment, and studios were, there were a lot of studios excited about this idea of Cameron making this underwater sci-fi action adventure film. But ultimately he stuck with Fox because of the success he had with Aliens. And the other studios, of course, knew about it then as a result, and were fast-tracking their own underwater action-adventure movies, and 2 of which, the Leviathan and Deep Star 6, both beat Cameron to market by 6 months or so. And unfortunately, both of them were quite poorly received, both critically and
I remember being scared by Leviathan watching on TV, but my standards, let's just say, were not as rigorous back then. So Universal Soldier was the acme, or like the zenith of entertainment back then. So
yeah. So that's sort of what led up to the Cameron's efforts to make this film. Of course, what was unique about this film more than anything was that Cameron wanted to, what they call, shoot it reel for real, which is essentially shooting everything underwater that needed to be shot underwater with real film cameras, with the real actors performing the roles in underwater,
as opposed to like James Wan just saying, let's just make it all blue and it'll look like they're underwater.
Exactly. And that will lead to our discussion later, how he's essentially doing the same thing with his Avatar 2 sequel, which is largely underwater. He's the first actor, first director in history to do motion capture of his performers underwater, which, I mean, we'll find out, I'm sure, in the next documentary about that film, how challenging this experience is. But it's
excellent.
He definitely is constantly looking to break those boundaries. And it's the first film to ever do sync audio underwater. Over 40% of the footage of the film was shot underwater in giant tanks from an old nuclear power plant, actually. And it really had a number of firsts just from the production process. And of course, we can get in later to the visual effects components that that changed the game.
Well, before we get to all the technical stuff, because obviously the technical achievements on this film are nothing short of awe-inspiring, but I feel like sometimes his work as a screenwriter gets overlooked. What are your thoughts on James Cameron as a writer overall? You know, all Harlan Ellison controversies surrounding the Terminator aside, but more importantly, tell us a little bit about the various sources of inspiration. You've already alluded a little bit to his high school idea, but from what I understand, he also based a lot of the character Lindsay on producer Gail Ann Hurd. And it's kind of remarkable how she was such a huge part of his life for so many of his best movies. And the marital strife he was experiencing in his own life is mirrored with the characters on the screen. So just talk a little bit about, just the creative process for James Cameron overall, but specifically, what do you think about his writing ambitions on this movie?
Well, I mean, you're right. Lindsay definitely is Gail Ann Hurd, without a doubt. And they were, not only were they going through they were married prior to the beginning of The Abyss being going into production, but they were in the process of getting a divorce throughout the production, which I'm sure added a whole nother level of stress to his.
James Cameron eats stress.
Yeah, he does, because she was his producer. She was the one, going in between the studio execs when they were like, "What the hell is going on over, down there? Why are you behind schedule?
Like
why
second guessing why they're buying more wetsuits." She's like, "Well, the chlorine to make the water clear is eating the suits, and everybody's body hair is falling off. Like, we need more wetsuits."
Right. So she had to somehow, despite their sort of personal fighting that may have been going on, she had to also be defending him and advocating for him throughout this whole process, this whole like 5-6 month shoot that took place in South Carolina. So it must have been a very challenging time for him on many levels. But maybe the divorce was okay because it allowed him to spend 12 to 16 hours a day underwater.
Yeah, it's like, as long as I'm in the tank, I don't have to talk to my lawyer.
That's right. That's right. So, but back to his writing. Yeah, this was based on an idea that he has as a teenager. But a lot of his films actually are based on dreams or ideas he had when he was younger, which he always sort of imagined he would eventually turn into a movie. I mean, The Terminator is famously based off of a fever dream that he had in Italy while he was filming Piranha 2: The Spawning.
Along with, we acknowledge the works of Harlan Ellison.
Yes.
As the movie says.
Yes. And also, I have to say that so many filmmakers borrow and steal from others to realize their own visions. I mean,
standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah, it's as long as you do acknowledge it, I think it's okay. I mean, Lucas was very much open about all the sort of influences from mythology that he was pulling into Star Wars when he was creating that script. So it's okay, in my opinion, as long as you're open about it and saying, these are the things that inspired me, and I just kind of took it to the next level.
Yeah, like 2001, which has a very clear At least it has a connective through line from 2001 to the end of this film, where you can tell James Cameron's trying to pay homage to the great master Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah. But even with The Abyss, I remember hearing once that which we'll talk about in detail more later, but the tidal wave sequence was also a dream he had. He had this sort of nightmarish dream of this tidal wave coming, which is apparently very common. It's a reoccurring. Psychologists talk about how if people have a dream of a tidal wave, a giant wave, like if you're standing on the beach coming towards them, it's supposed to symbolize that you're, stressed and anxiety, that you're feeling overwhelmed.
Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did it a couple times. Namor the Submariner. It seems like every time he'd get pissed off about something back in the early 60s, he'd launch a giant tidal wave at the surface world. It's like, give me the Invisible Woman or you all have to die.
But I think it also just is something that we all can, if you've ever been on a coastline, you can kind of imagine what would you feel if this giant wave was coming towards you. It would be you would feel more helpless than you've ever felt in your life. There's nothing you can do about it. It's coming. But I think he wrote, though, in this film in particular, I've always enjoyed his writing. He does a great job of writing action adventure set pieces that are just phenomenal, first of all. But he also does a really great job of creating, at the core of his movies, love stories between two very equal male and female characters that are, first
True
of all,
Lies. True Lies is basically a romantic comedy disguised as an action flick.
Exactly, and I think all of his films are, first and foremost for him, a romantic love story in some way, shape, or form, and it's just sort of set to the backdrop of something that's sci-fi or adventure or action, and that's obviously what we're connecting with is that love story component. But there are many things that we've discussed before about Cameron's film, many themes that run through all of them. He's very obsessed not just with water, but also with the threat of nuclear annihilation, which is a big issue, obviously, in the Terminator films, but also in The Abyss, especially the special edition, where we really see that. Again, this is during the height of the Cold War, so this is a time when a lot of people were really very nervous about the possibility of something happening with nuclear weapons. So he was tapping into that sort of fear that we all had. But in The Abyss, he took it down underwater. So not only do we have the nuclear threat fear, but we also have this underwater fear of drowning, something this primitive, primordial fear that we all have.
Or just freezing, the hypothermia.
Just freezing, the darkness, the fear. This film is really a strange combination of all the best things in storytelling. It's man against man. It's man against nature, with the hurricane happening and with the things that are beyond their control underwater. It's man against himself in more than anything, and it's man against the unknown, the alien creatures. So he somehow was able to make this layered effect of 4 different types of conflict.
I think even if you take all the sci-fi elements regarding the aliens completely out of the movie, it would still stand on its own as a great underwater thriller. Maybe not on the level of The Hunt for the Red October or Crimson Tide, but there's a lot of meat on that steak to choose to sink your teeth into before you even get to the more far-fetched elements.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think he did an incredible job of building up to an ending, which again, for a lot of people in the theatrical release was very they kind of caught them off guard. They weren't quite sure what to expect. But I always felt, maybe because I knew enough about it going in, that it wasn't quite as shocking as I always knew there was going to be some kind of supernatural or some kind of sort of amazing ending to the film, because you start off the opening sequence, you see this sort of alien-looking pod fly past a nuclear submarine, causing it to crash. Right away there's something going on here. It's not just a Cold War thriller like The Hunt for Red October. So I mean, it was a constant issue, I think, in the editing room as well, is how are we going to sort of wrap this movie up and keep it under 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely be getting in. Well, actually, might as well go ahead and jump ahead to that question. I'm going to rearrange things a bit.
Sure.
Because I've heard a lot of conflicting stories about the decisions that ultimately led to the two different cuts of the film. And this is one of my favorite lines by James Cameron, but he essentially has stated that the best way to reduce a film's running time at sometimes is not to chip away at it here and there, but to take an entire subplot and just remove it entirely. It's much easier to reduce your running time that way. But there's an elaborate history of the two different cuts. And first and foremost, what are the pros and cons of the two competing versions? But I've heard that James Cameron, ultimately, it was his decision to remove the wave because the special effects just weren't there yet. But I've also heard the studio was pushing him for a shorter movie. So just walk us through how we arrived at the two different cuts, and what do you think are the pros and cons of the two competing versions?
Sure. Okay. So basically, this film was way over budget and behind schedule to begin with. So he was already up against a deadline. I believe it was July 6th. It was early July that they were hoping to release this movie. And now this is the summer of 1989. It was a pretty big summer for movies. We had the Tim Burton Batman. We had Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. We had Lethal Weapon 2, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which we know is the biggest movie of that year. But this movie, The Abyss, was one of the only sort of original blockbuster films, not based on another property, not a sequel. So it was, for a lot of people, really exciting, and people were anticipating it, especially after the success of Aliens and Terminator. So Cameron was way under the gun to get this thing done for a summer release. This was a big summer movie for Fox. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, the visual effects at the time were a huge constraint for him. He was tinkering around with the film, and the big ending with the tidal waves that was in the original script and cut and was fully part of what he intended to release. He just wasn't happy, as you mentioned, with the results that Industrial Light and Magic were coming up with. They were essentially using like a plastic wave that they were going to film and do and animate somehow. And this just wasn't, Cameron the perfectionist wasn't happy with that. And so I think as soon as he realized that he was they pushed it to August 9th. That was the new release date to give him a little more time to tinker with it and try to make it as good as it could be. But as soon as he realized that he couldn't make that effect sequence at the end of the movie look the way he wanted to in his head, he basically made the decision, I don't want people to see it that way, so I'm going to excise this whole subplot. And that sort of was a backwards chain reaction. So anything that led up to that, the whole Cold War subplot with the buildup of the Soviet submarines and the newsreel footage.
Like a reverse domino effect going backwards through the story where you remove all these little pieces.
It took, I think, 20 minutes or so was just immediately able to be cut down. And that was huge for him because it allowed him to then just refocus his energies on the rest of the film.
Yeah. It's not the best solution, but it was a solution.
It was a solution that was with the time constraint that he had. He did, and one thing that I didn't realize originally, but he did actually have Final Cut, or a type of Final Cut at this time in his career, but it wasn't a Final Cut where he can make the movie as long as he wanted it. It was a Final Cut that said, you can do whatever you want as long as it's 2 hours and 15 minutes. Essentially, he could make his movie the way he wanted to make it, but they still wanted for marketing and business purposes to be able to show X number of screenings.
You get one more screening per day in there. So.
Exactly. So, and I think it ended up, he ended up hitting that mark, or maybe just a few minutes longer. So the decision was ultimately his. In fact, there was one old article I found that said that many of the executives at Fox were the ones who were shocked and almost dismayed by the fact that he was cutting the climax of his movie. I mean, they knew from the script this was the big reveal. It was kind of a day the earth
the money shot. Yeah, it's like the parting of the Red Seas and the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, and so they were just like, "What is he doing? He's cutting off the entire ending of the movie." So but for Cameron, it was a way of putting out a version of the movie, at least to a standard that he was happy with at the time, because he couldn't push back any longer. And he essentially, I would say, it's like what they say with any art or any filmmaker. They don't. He just kind of abandoned the movie. He didn't finish it per se. He abandoned it and let it go out into the world as is, on August 9th, 1989, but always with the idea that he would hopefully revisit it at some point when the technology sort of caught up to the visions that he had in his head. So it's and of course, as you mentioned, 1993, so about 4 years later, after the huge success of Terminator 2, he was able to sign a $500 million development deal with Fox.
That's a good deal.
And something like 500,000, I may be remembering incorrectly, was allocated within that budget for him to complete The Abyss in its entirety the way he originally intended to do so, in which it included having ILM go back and redo the ocean, some of the ocean scenes.
It looks fucking gorgeous. I mean, you watch it now, and this is 26 years later or 30 years later. I mean, well, I guess actions and special effects, 26 years later.
Yeah.
But the wave looks incredible. It looks almost tangible.
Yeah, yeah. And they even had a short theatrical release. A lot of people didn't realize this, but it did play in New York and LA for, I'm not quite sure how long, but for a couple weeks maybe.
Probably coincided with like the Laserdisc release.
Exactly. Yeah, it was probably a marketing, effort to sort of announce. But at this point, it was only available on Laserdisc. So it was a big push by Cameron to say Laserdisc is the way to see this movie. Widescreen, THX, as you said, AC3. If you're gonna watch this, watch it this way.
I had an entire box of Laserdiscs. I remember I spent $200 on getting the Wild Bunch on Laserdisc. And 2 years later, DVD. I was like, oh, maybe I could have saved that cash. But for a brief shining moment, I had a nice. But luckily, my school library at University of Virginia, the Clemens Library, had thousands of Laserdiscs. So I at least got my money's worth from the player by being able to borrow so many great movies. But that's another topic for another day.
No, yeah. I mean, it at the time, it was the best. And in fact, many people don't even realize this, but Laserdisc was still better quality than DVD. It had less compression. It was a different compression format. So DVD was more convenient in that they could fit more on a smaller disc, and you didn't have to.
But they were crummy at first. You had to flip them. I mean, some early DVDs sucked.
Yeah, exactly. So even though DVD popped up, like you said, a couple years later, Laserdisc for a long time was still arguably the format for cinephiles. Until Blu-ray essentially came along, it was still considered the best quality way to watch a film in your home.
And they just look gorgeous. They're heavy and they're thick. Yeah. It's like records on steroids. Exactly. I loved them.
And then it came out on VHS. The Fox introduced the Fox widescreen series VHS. They were these big gold clamshell packages, and they released True Lies and The Abyss in widescreen, and the special edition that was in '96. So that's when I actually first saw the special edition, was in 1996 on the widescreen VHS edition. And I was just floored by it. I was like, wow. I mean, I had the original VHS tape that came out in 1990, and I'd watched it dozens of times. But as soon as I saw that special edition, I was like, this is the version the only version I'm watching. I
haven't watched it. I watched the theatrical cut plenty of times on HBO, pan and scan, low res. I will never watch that version again. I need a little more clarity in the final 30 minutes. But we've been dancing around this topic for a while, but now I think it's finally time to start sinking our teeth into the hell of making this movie. Because I feel like whether you're talking about The Island of Dr. Moreau or Fitzcarraldo or Apocalypse Now, film history is littered with these legendary, difficult productions. So I want you to describe what is a typical day in the life of the cast and crew of The Abyss, especially when they're shooting in Tank A, because it seems like from watching dailies upside down and decompressing, and I mean just walk us through what Ed Harris and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio and James Cameron would experience on a typical day early in the shoot.
Well, I wasn't there, but I obviously have watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot of articles about this over the years, and it was pretty well documented. In fact, there's a 60-minute documentary called Under Pressure, Making the Abyss, which is available on. It was first on the Laserdisc, but it's also on the DVD, which was released in 2000.
But it's the double DVD. If you buy the single DVD, it's not there. But yeah, the double one, and it's still available. If you watch it on your widescreen TV or HDTV, you're gonna be disappointed by the format. But at least the documentary is there.
At least it's there, and it's actually something that Cameron commissioned himself for the Laserdisc release. He was. It's almost like he he wanted to revisit the hell and show the world what he went through to make this movie. Most directors, I think, would just be like, I don't ever want to talk about this again. In fact, that's what happened with some of the cast members. So,
yeah, Ed Harris is notoriously tight-lipped.
Yeah, so is Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. She has never spoken about it since the kind of press junket promotional tour that they had that summer.
Yeah, when your lead actress is having to scream in the director's face, "We are not animals," you probably have crossed a line of some kind.
Yeah, but essentially everything that could go wrong went wrong. They were shooting this giant nuclear tank, that they enclosure, and they filled it with million. I don't even know how many gallons of water. It was massive. They built the entire deep core rig inside this and filled it with water, covered it with these black beads, and then a tarp on top of that because it needed to make it look like it was underwater, 2,000 feet underwater.
Yeah, like with the bead, it would block out some light, but if you needed to get to the surface quickly, it wouldn't prevent you from reaching the surface.
Right, you could surface and break through and get air if there was an emergency. So it was a smart solution. But here you have, 25 perhaps crew members at a time, and your lead actors all in diving suits underwater, acting underwater, filming these scenes and doing their dialogue, sync dialogue into microphones in their helmets that were, aircraft, quality microphones that they use, in the military, so they could record this audio. And of course, there's also these loud popping sounds from the regulators, that they had to cut out, in between every other word practically in post-production and the sound design, so that you're not hearing that. But yeah,
but you hear it in Under Pressure when James Cameron, he would have the only microphone for like giving instructions to cast and crew, and you could just hear even in like an hour of watching the documentary, you start to dread that sound. It's the most annoying sound you've ever fucking heard.
But like some of it was just an inconvenience, but other stuff there were actual moments where these actors could have died. And Ed Harris had a moment like that where they actually shot the scene where he's going down the trench sideways and sort of pulled him along with a cord and shot it sideways, so it looked like, because obviously this tank wasn't deep enough to shoot him actually going down.
And physically, your body just wouldn't be able to take it.
Yeah, exactly. So they shot it sideways, and he was wearing a helmet with that liquid
pink goo
fluid that he wasn't really breathing. He had to hold his breath between every take, then immediately drain the liquid and get a regulator on his mouth so he could breathe some air in between takes. So he's holding his breath, and his sort of, I guess, support diver got tangled up on something and couldn't get to him between takes, and he was like bugging out. He couldn't breathe, and then someone ran over, got him a regulator. Someone else, an assistant got him a regulator, but put it in upside down by accident, causing him to breathe in too much, I guess.
Apparently got a lot of water with the air.
Water.
So he got some air, but he also was choking to death.
Exactly. And so finally, the cameraman actually pushed this guy aside, pulled that regulator, upside down regulator out of his mouth, and shoved one in his mouth and gave him some air. But apparently this really scarred Ed Harris, this experience. He has said in interviews since that he just broke down crying on the drive home that night, and he really thought this was it. Here you are in the dark, underwater. No, you can't communicate to get help. It must have been a harrowing experience. But there were, as I mentioned, there were other little things, like you said, the chlorine in the tanks was bleaching everyone's hair white and was causing,
all their body hair to fall out.
Chemical burns on their skin. So they had to get the chlorine levels right. This is like the whole crew. There were decompression problems where the actors didn't stay down for more than a couple hours, but Cameron was down sometimes 12 hours a day. So he would have to sit and watch dailies underwater for like 3 hours while he decompressed. And so you can
Wouldn't he do it sometimes upside down to alleviate the pain and tension in his shoulders? Because like all the gear and all the equipment was so heavy, that, like he was getting almost like spinal compression problems.
Yeah, he had to like hang onto like a cord or a cable, and maybe he laid sideways or something. I'm not sure, but yeah,
to alleviate the pain.
They did different tricks to kind of help him. But
yeah, Bill Scurry pointed this out on Twitter earlier, how it sucked to be in the cast and crew. However, no matter what unimaginable hardship physically you were enduring, James Cameron was at least doing the equal, if not more.
He was, and many crew members who have talked about the film after the fact have said just that he was doing everything that they were doing, and sometimes 2 to 3 times more, and working longer hours. And he would never ask anyone, actor or crew member, to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. So you have to respect that. You have to respect that he wasn't just being a tyrant and demanding people to do this and that.
Yeah, but he wasn't in Video Village with a monitor and a latte screaming at people with like a bullhorn. He was actually in the thick of things.
Exactly. And some directors say that now they won't, even like Christopher Nolan won't use a Video Village because he feels that creates a sense that he's sort of better than the rest of the crew. So what he'll do is just stand next to the camera and be there right with his actors and watch them. And by doing that, it kind of democratizes the filmmaking experience.
It's smart. Yeah, I remember when I worked on Hannibal, the Ridley Scott film, gaining even temporary access to Video Village was like going into like the VIP room in a club, like, ooh, I'm going into Video Village. But it definitely creates a sense of us versus them.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a bad, difficult shoot for that 40% of the movie that was shot underwater. Of course, they eventually moved to interiors and miniature shoots and things like that. But
they're still flooding sets and doing all sorts of horrible, dangerous things.
People were just strung out. They were tired. Michael Biehn reported that even though he was good friends with Cameron from working on The Abyss and Aliens, Terminator and Aliens prior to this, he said he was there for 5 months, but only worked like 3 weeks or something like that. So, but that's not uncommon on a big film.
A lot of hurry up and wait.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a difficult shoot, to say the least. But, he wanted to do something that had never been done. It was the first film to shoot sync dialogue underwater, as I mentioned. It was also the first film to attempt a computer-generated sequence that had a character, essentially, the pseudopod water tentacle, that interacted with physical objects and actors on.
And it still looks killer to this day.
Yeah, it's an amazing sequence, and it really did change the course of filmmaking as a result.
Without a doubt. Well, hey, we only got a couple of minutes before I open up the conversation, everybody. So real quick, I just want you to put on your thinking cap or your powers of prophecy, because between The Abyss, Titanic, his documentaries, Ghost of the Abyss and Aliens of the Deep, and Piranha 2, as I mentioned, obviously James Cameron has got a thing for the water. I think in 2012, he set the record for the deepest solo dive in history.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about Avatar 2? And do you have any predictions or theories regarding that you would like to share?
Well, Avatar 2 slated currently for December 18th, 2020. So we're, looking at, a year and a half away, about a little more.
Comes a month after Dune.
Yeah, it's completed. It's completely shot at this point, all the motion capture photography. I think they're doing some of the additional photography in New Zealand right now. But as I mentioned, it's the first film to do motion capture with live actors underwater. So what that means and what that will look like, we'll soon find out. But the big thing for me is that Cameron, of course, not wanting to just leave. The 3D breakthrough that was the first Avatar is probably the most memorable part of that film for me. It's just it was like looking through a window. It was not about things popping out at you. It was about the depth that felt like you were looking through a window into another world. And it was such a mesmerizing experience on a big screen. But he's had 10 years now to improve on that.
And you can see those improvements in Alita Battle Angel. I went to see it in a really nice 3D screen here, and I hate 3D. I fucking despise 3D. However, for Alita Battle Angel, he made me a believer.
Well, and this is what I don't know if you've heard this, but Lightstorm Entertainment, his company, partnered and has been partnering with Christie Digital for years now to develop the first RGB laser projection system, which is a new type of projection system that Avatar 2 will implement. The first film, it will not require 3D glasses. You will be able to see absolutely, it says crystalline clear images in the most, three-dimensional way you've ever seen without having anything to wear on your head or look through. So that alone may be the thing that makes this movie explode. You know, people
Well, I'll
are
still
gonna
have
be
to wear
super
my new
curious.
distraction-free hat. I want to give you
Oh, yeah.
an image of this. See how it's got like horse blinders on the side?
Yeah.
It's a cap I ordered from Germany for movies. Now, people use it in offices to keep the peripheral vision like out of sight, out of mind. But I've got this now to block out cell phones, so I'll never see the glow of anyone's cell phone ever again. So no matter what the format will be, I'll be wearing my new super cool visor to protect me from
Well,
my
it'll be
fellow
much
movie goers.
easier. You won't have to have
Look
like,
at
funky
Scurry
glasses.
rocking out his scuba gear. All right, well, it is 2:45, so as
Okay.
promised, we're gonna start opening things up to a wider conversation with everyone in the chat. Scurry's got some experience with some underwater exploration, so I can't think of a better person to handle some of this. So I've got some follow-up questions for both Adam and Bill. But first and foremost, Bill, welcome back to the chat. What have y'all been talking about in the chat room? I've been trying to jump in and out when I can, but I've missed the majority of it.
Well, we had a great time talking a lot of things here. Really good time. You know, and now to hear on this show, that I, you know, I'm digging it really kind of a little way. I
Need
don't
to
know.
go.
Is this better? Is this going to work better?
But I think the goggles should at least
Let me
stay
try
in the short term.
Yeah. So we've had a good time. We've had a good time here chatting. with
Matthias is
everybody.
in the chat. All right, so yeah, quick shout out. There are so many people here that I've collaborated with, or just who create content that I watch. But obviously, Matthias van der Roos, Joe Duffy, Steve Amos, John Gribbs. I mean, so many familiar faces. And Grevlane, I don't know if I know Grevlane, but Grevlane, welcome to the chat. So I just want to say hello.
Gidget
Yeah, Gidget, who I've been interacting with for years on Twitter.
Amos, you got Amos, Joe Duffy, you got Fred FC Schaefer, as you know very well, Film and Vinyls here.
Film and Vinyl, very cool. Alexandria, very nice.
Yeah. This is a full house. This is pretty good. Randall's in here. Yeah,
Beautiful.
So many people I know, some I don't, but we're having a good time here. Thank you for the Dune ring. Thank you very much for noticing that, Randall. I appreciate that.
You know, but you got to hold it like this, like Paul.
The ducal sigil of House Atreides. Oh,
is Adam getting a toy?
Yeah, he's about to blow me out of the water.
Adam, you just retrieve a toy to out-geek Bill
Speaking
Scurry?
of Dune, I found something in storage. I used to, back in the day, collect a lot of non-sport trading cards, and I found in my storage a sealed box of Dune cards, unopened. And here you go. Look, you got the wax packs with bubble gum still in them.
Wow.
It tastes like Harkonnens. That's great.
I was that kid who didn't open anything. He saved everything in its packaging.
That's intense.
That's insane. That's crazy.
All right. Well, Mr. Scurry, the spotlight is now yours. What do you got for us?
Well, what do you want to hear? You want to hear what was going on in the chat, or
I know. Yeah, I'll start. Well, I know Steve Amos sent you some questions ahead of time. Since Steve Amos, who's a contributor to Film 89, a great website as well as a great podcast. Let's start with whatever he had to say.
Yeah, Steve came up with some great questions, and I mean, you guys alluded to it. The idea of the people doing method acting, where they didn't have to imagine what it's like to drown because they were actually busy drowning. But Steve writes as follows: I think that the resuscitation scene is one of the most intense moments in film history, especially considering Harris was acting directly at the camera, not to Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio for much of it. Do you agree that it wasn't Bean that deserved the Oscar nod or the potential Oscar nod, that it was actually Ed Harris?
I think it's the best performance of Ed Harris's career. I mean, it's he's done so much great stuff, but it is, I think, also dramatically, it might be the best scene that James Cameron has ever constructed, just from a purely dramatic standpoint, with great dialogue, great actors doing their thing, totally invested. But Adam, what do you think?
I honestly think all three of them delivered Oscar-worthy performances. I think they put everything they had into these roles, and and that was I really do give a lot of credit to Cameron pushing them, just like Kubrick would do, to get the best possible performance out of them, take after take after take. They're all extremely talented actors, but I think
Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio was also physically undressed, which made it intensely awkward for her repeatedly as Ed Harris is thumping on her chest.
And Ed Harris was being rather violent with her. They were doing the paddles to try to shock her back to life, slapping her face back and forth. So without a doubt, that scene could be an Oscar scene for the two of them. But I agree too that Michael Biehn really did. If he had won an Oscar, he would have been a huge leading man after that movie. It would have, or if this film had been a blockbuster like T2 was, Michael Biehn would have just gone on to, I mean, he did go on to shoot Navy SEALs with Charlie Sheen.
Yeah.
So.
It's a remarkable performance. I mean, just seeing him like slashing his forearm
Yeah.
when people are out of view, like just seeing him come unspooled. I mean, he's wound pretty tightly from word go, but he just starts disintegrating before our eyes over the course of the film. And man, that dude's intensity, I absolutely love it. But one of the weirdest stories I ever heard in my life behind the scenes of making a movie, some horror movie that Michael Biehn was on, and he lied and said that his mother was dead because he wanted to take like a couple of days off to go on some bender, and somebody came to his trailer and asked him, like, to express their condolences, and he's like, "My mother isn't dead, you dope," and like leaned forward and bit the person. Like, he's a complete maniac, but you can feel it on the screen in The Abyss.
I do think, though, that the interesting thing about his performance, Michael's performance, is that he's the antagonist, but he's not really a bad guy per se. He's not an evil person. He was sick with the water pressure sickness. He was under orders during a Cold War buildup that he felt, after being cut off from his chain of command, that it was up to him to potentially save, the world. The world. He thought in his head, and I think in many ways,
every villain is the hero of their own
story.
Exactly.
But he really wasn't. Again, until that moon pool battle between Ed Harris and him, he didn't really hurt anybody per se. Yes, he did go off under orders to retrieve the nuclear warhead, which in turn caused the tether to pull the whole thing over the cliff, and 7 guys on the crew died. So he did cause, inadvertently people to be killed, but he wasn't going around and shooting people.
He wasn't a mustache twirling villain, at least initially. But Bill, since you've done some diving, what are the symptoms that he's experiencing initially when we start seeing like his hand shaking and he's claiming that he's been cleared physically? But what are those risks that a diver faces?
Well, I mean, I think that's bullshit, to be honest with you. The idea that you would have pressure sickness isn't something I've ever heard of. Now, the thing is, I just do conventional diving, which is a tank of air, not oxygen, but air on your back. The real danger of diving is something called nitrogen narcosis. And it has more to do with the fact that you lose, it's because of the gas mixture. I don't want to get too nerdy about it. The gas mixture going into your body kind of chokes you off for a little, either too much oxygen or not enough. I forget which one it is. But the idea, you start to lose sense. And when you're underwater, you're already disoriented anyway. And, if you're sort of poisoning your brain a little bit with a gas, you don't even know that you're making bad decisions. And that's how a lot of people drown. I've heard of that happening. And obviously, there's also decompression sickness, but that is more of a physical thing. That's nitrogen bubbles forming in your blood. I've never heard, the bends. I've never heard of anything about, like somebody cutting their hand under a table. I don't, the idea of like the whole deep drilling thing is a whole separate set of like occupational issues that are real, I'm sure, but I just don't know shit about those. But I don't know. I mean, Cameron could have made that up just as like a nice bugaboo for his bad guy to have.
I always was under the impression the reason why that was a concern in this film setting was that they did something unique in that they pressurized the air in the station in deep core to match the pressure on the on the water, and that's the issue why they had to obviously decompress, because normally you would be in a pressurized submarine. You're in a pressurized submarine that is still pressurized for surface. Yeah. So you don't need the decompression. But when you're in and that's why they could have the moon pool, right? Because you could have the air above it like that. So it's just, I think it had to do with the way the concept of the deep core station being pressurized at the bottom of the ocean to match the exterior pressure. But again, I'm not a scientist, so.
James, you mentioned something about Cameron working harder than anybody else on the set. The idea, I think you're intimating, Adam, that Cameron, at the end of the day, because he spent so much time underwater, you have to decompress. And conventionally, when you're diving at conventional levels, you do 3 minutes at 15 to 20 feet, and that's it. You hang in the water column, you just stay there, and you do something called off-gassing, where your body releases nitrogen out through your breath. It's a natural thing. Cameron stayed underwater so long all day, he would have to decompress for close to like an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours. So they said that they actually he was actually doing his dailies in the water while he was upside down, off-gassing at like 20 or 30 feet, because he just had soaked up so much, like the hazard of what he dealt with his body, the game he was playing with his health was just kind of amazing. And that's like, again, knowing a little bit of what I play with in terms of mortality every now and then is one thing.
Right.
But Cameron just did that. He would punch in every day and just spend fucking 14, 15 hours underwater, which the human body is not designed to do.
Right. And there was even a quote he put out where he said something like, for every hour you guys are trying to pick out what magazine to read, I'm underwater getting ready for the day's shoot, you know?
Yeah.
So there was a little animosity I could, you know, between him and the crew in that respect, or the actors.
But also a lot of gallows humor when people making
Yeah.
T-shirts with all these like these play on words when it came to the name, and also people joking about, as you mentioned, like Diver's Delight and stuff like that. So it seems like on any given day it was awful, but you could gallows humor can get you through a lot of hardship as well.
So wait, Steve Amos has a few more questions. I think.
Fire away.
Yeah, so in addition, you know, it's a tangent to that first question about the resuscitation scene, and this is one that I actually believe in, or at least it's worth asking. Has Cameron ever made a more human film? And I think that I will add my own editorial on this one, is that Cameron comes across as an aloof, sort of very detached kind of guy, intellectual, a bit of a technician. You know, maybe it's that Ontario upbringing, that sort of Canadian thing. He doesn't just rip with intensity like some other people do. So I think his work could read as cold. I mean, so does that mean anything to you? Either Cameron's disposition or this movie having more blood in it?
Avatar feels colder emotionally, and the characters feel more removed. But I would agree that when it comes, I mean, we were having a little discussion earlier about what's the best ensemble cast you've ever worked with. And in terms of just a pack of badasses doing incredible things, obviously Aliens is quite an ensemble. But when it comes to rich characters, very human characters who don't have machine guns and who don't have like all these superhuman abilities, I do think that The Abyss, just little things like the scene where what's the name of the character with the cowboy hat? She's like something like One Night Stands or One Night Stand.
Yeah, just one night. Yeah.
Yeah. And when she's in her submersible listening to country music and they're dragging the station and they're all singing together, that might be the warmest moment that James Cameron has ever shot.
And that's actually a cut scene. There's only one shot of that in the theatrical. When the submersible comes towards the camera, and you can hear just her singing for like a split second. But the remaining, the shots before and after, where they're all getting in on it, kind of having a good time, that was all part of the special edition. So
what's funny also, I love how her character, when she first sees Lindsay, she makes a little gagging motion, because early on in the movie, some people might say like, man, James Cameron's being a little mean to this Lindsay character because she gets called bitch, I think 20 times in the first like 10 minutes. But obviously she designed the entire rig. She's the smartest scientist in the movie. Like, she has a lot of other qualities that I think balance out all the insults. But I liked how it wasn't just the dude saying, oh my God, like queen bitch, blah, blah, blah. You see One Night Stand also going when she's having to be polite to her. So I just thought that was an interesting little touch.
All right, how about this one? Cribs says, and we were chatting about this one a little bit in the chat, was actually, I don't know this movie, Besson's Big Blue, The Abyss versus Jim Cameron's Abyss versus Besson's Big Blue. What do you think about that?
I'm horrified to acknowledge that I've not seen The Big Blue yet. I've watched, I think Subway is the earliest Luc Besson film that I've seen, and I really enjoyed Subway. It's fucking wild, and it's been on my to-do list for like 23 years, but I can't speak to it. But Mr. Cribs, you're in the chat. Lay it on us. What do you prefer? Do you prefer Big Blue or do you prefer The Abyss? I think we got like a 20, maybe a couple second delay.
I haven't seen it either. I'm ashamed as well.
Yeah, and it's dangerous territory even mentioning Luc Besson, since he's I think he's on trial for some criminal assault charges and so on and so forth. So
I think he was. I don't know. I thought I heard that they dropped all the charges.
He has a flick coming out this summer, but he is. It is quicksand to even discuss Luc Besson right now. But I definitely would be putting Big Blue in the list. But sadly, I cannot answer that question. He got us with that one.
All right, I got one. This comes from Bill S. In the chat room. He asks, the gap between Titanic and Avatar is this like amazing vacancy in a man's career. You know, I don't know if any other filmmaker voluntarily kind of bugged out of the industry.
We made 2 feature-length documentaries in that time, but no narrative movies.
But it's like the obsession this guy made with jumping into like the Marianas Trench. It's like it was vanity at that point. He was making documentaries that were mostly about his exploits, about the things he wanted to cover, and he built these submersibles by himself. He was this submarine designer. He kind of went crazy. But I mean, it's like a big risk, especially if you had the biggest hit in Hollywood at that time and you decide to get the fuck out. You just like peace out of the business. Who else could have done something like that? Not that he knew
Kubrick.
that. Kubrick. Yeah, but I mean, Kubrick was more idiosyncratic than Cameron. Cameron just seems so suburban, you know?
I think that, and people have said this, Cameron, in another life, would have been a scientist. He was. I think he's part. Someone once said he's half scientist, half artist, and that's 2 different sides of the brain. You know, for them to work,
like an Arthur C. Clarke persona,
to sync together in such a good, you know, so effectively is a rare thing. And I think he just felt like, well, I had this massive hit. Now I can go off and do the stuff I really always wanted to do, you know, explore the ocean, look for sunken boats, and use my, you know, technology to capture all this on film. I think it was just him saying, how do I top this? First of all, what do I do to top this?
I mean, I think that streak from Terminator to True Lies, that was a 10-year streak, obviously as Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, Terminator 2, and True Lies. That's as good a 10-year period as any filmmaker in the time that I've been alive on this planet. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of directors out there who've had like great 10-year hot streaks, but once you've done that 10-year hot streak, I don't know if I'm in the minority or the majority, but I don't like Titanic, so I don't even talk about Titanic. But I think that 10-year period of his is very tough to match or equal. And as an artist, it's got to be kind of crippling in some ways.
He did do some things, though, other than the documentaries. I mean, there was that show he spearheaded.
He produced Solaris with Steven Soderbergh,
right?
And things like
Dark
that.
Angel, that TV series with Eliza Dushku.
But he wasn't in the driver's seat for a while.
No, but he was sort of overseeing it on a executive producer level. And he was tempted on several occasions to direct other projects that he ended up not doing. I mean, he had his Spider-Man script, which Sam Raimi.
Oh yeah. Let's get into that. That's worth talking about.
I mean, they thought his script was too violent, really, and more than anything, that it was too dark, too violent. And this is long before The Dark Knight or before any of the darker films came out. So that could have happened, right? That could have been his next film if the studio had greenlit the script that he had written, which I've read a little bit of it, and it's pretty interesting. Like it starts off really bold. Like I still to this day wonder what his version of that Spider-Man would have been like.
Dr. Octopus was the villain, I think, in that one.
I think so, yeah, in the original.
Yeah, I mean, and that was, I'm guessing that was early 90s. Is that when it was after Terminator? Mid 90s, 95? Is that?
Yeah, I think he had been toying with like drafts for many years, but it was still something that they were looking to potentially make after Titanic's release. It was still something that his script was at the top of the list of ones that they really were considering. And some of the things actually did carry over. It was Cameron's idea that he would have organic web shooters, that it would be part of his biology, which is such a Cameron concept if you think about it.
It always annoyed me because part of Peter Parker's charm is that he's a science dork.
Right. Yeah. But, I think that the physics of shooting spider webs out of a little wrist bracelet, Cameron was probably like, that can't work. That's no way. I can't justify that. He's very, he needs everything to make sense scientifically.
So if Marvel Comics wise, you skip ahead to Blade and X-Men, that's the beginning, but Cameron could have started the Marvel era of filmmaking 4 or 5 years earlier. That's kind of amazing. You imagine where that would have went. It would have sort of scrubbed the whole Roger Corman taint, the New World Pictures thing off of like all those cheapy deals that Stan Lee made 20 years earlier. That would have happened a lot sooner.
Well, Bill, before we get to more questions, I actually have one for you because I know that you are a massive Werner Herzog fanatic. How would you compare the hell of working on some of Herzog's more famous productions to the hell of working on James Cameron's productions? And if you had to choose one of their hellacious productions to be a part of as a crew member, what volcano would you jump into with either Herzog or Cameron?
Oh man, that's a good question. Well, I tell you, I don't think anybody drowned on a Herzog set because they were above dry land for the most part. But there's something poetic about watching the opening shot of Agira, the Wrath of God, seeing all those people humping up the hill with wagon wheels and cannons on their back, and obviously watching the indigenous people of Peru pull a steamship over a mountain in the Amazon, the Andes. It looks to me like you are set up for some sort of kind of seminal greatness working with Herzog, because he's a different director. He is the man you want exploring the universe. Jim Cameron, for as much as I love his work, I don't think he's much of a poet, nor do I think he's got a poet in his soul. So I think if I'm going to ally myself with the charisma of a director worth dying for, of malaria or dengue, I want to hang out with Kinski and just sort of like watch that kind of shit happen, like from Cobra Verde. I rather than Cameron, who just sort of seems like he comes off like an Opie kind of guy. Oh, shucks, gee whiz, let's get back to work today. Let's give it our all. And it's like, you don't really see the passion, the fire. Cameron's not going to reveal the essential truths of life.
My dad saw James Cameron one time in person. For whatever reason, Linda Hamilton and James Cameron were in Richmond, Virginia, at this great pizza joint called Julian's. And my dad and stepmom were like, "Oh my God, that's Linda Hamilton! Like we love her. She's so fantastic. Like, who is that dork?" She's sitting, and they sat there the whole dinner just talking trash about what a goober Linda Hamilton had. And it turns out a few years later, they're watching the Oscars, like, oh, that's that goober who was wearing like acid wash jeans and tennis shoes and so on and so forth.
You know what Cameron needed, and I'm failing on trying to find another example, a correlative of this. Cameron needed like a co-writer or someone in his camp, like a Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens, like Peter Jackson has. He needed someone human who dug into the warmth of the human experience a little more to offset his more cold, icy blue technical aspects. Again, not that Jim Cameron needs any help from anybody, obviously, but it seems like his work would have prospered and had a much different impression if he spoke to people's humanity a little bit more, rather than was just the avatar, so to speak, the avatar of action filmmaking, a guy who is this boundary pusher. And I hate to bring this up because I know Becky Becky talks about her love of like Edward Furlong, but like that whole thing nearly ruins Terminator 2 for me. And I almost feel like there's something about spelling out the effect of a kid or the lifestyle of a kid, the voice of a child really gets away from Cameron, and Eddie Furlong doesn't come off very well in Terminator to me. I don't care how perfect a lot of people say he is at that role. And sometimes I wonder, it's like, man, if there was somebody else, somebody who was there to get the voice right, to kind of get behind the eyeballs of somebody in that position, would that work sound differently? Again, I'm not going to say
like if you could get the warmth of Close Encounters of the Third Kind somehow to shine through some of his films, would he have found yet? Because I feel like of all of his movies, The End of the Abyss comes closest to that Spielberg. I know he was going for Kubrick, but for me, it comes across as more Spielbergian toward the end, or maybe it's just his own unique thing that he's got going on. But there's a warmth to Spielberg that eludes James Cameron.
How about like maybe I'm even thinking of the wrong job. Maybe he needs like a Thelma Schoonmaker or a Sally Menke. Those people were able to dash on humanity into the work, and it's like you had these in sua generis creators who were incredible visual filmmakers and guys who understood story. But what Thelma would do with Marty's work is way different than what Marty would do by himself. And the same thing, Sally Menke informed Tarantino's work, sanded down some raw edges, added some rough edges to others, but increased the work and improved it in a way that we wouldn't necessarily know what it's like unless you see a long train of work without those two people.
Yeah, both Scorsese and Tarantino's career would be quite different without their lifelong editors.
Yeah, and maybe the co-writer is one thing, because it's like, who wrote for Spielberg? A whole hoary host of people. He had Melissa Matheson working for him, and so on and so forth, in the golden age of people who were coming in and punching up Spielberg's work. But, maybe it's someone like, who is it, Verna Fields, I think is really maybe the key to Jaws as much as Spielberg's filmmaking. And Thelma's editing and Sally Menke's editing. And I'm just, those are the first examples I can think of. But that's a pretty key job. They wind up being co-conspirators. You make you make up the movie with them in the beginning, and then you remake the movie in the edit booth over a Steenbeck or a Moviola with these people. And maybe that would have been different rather than Cameron being a one-man show.
Some critics say the same thing about Christopher Nolan, that there's a lack of humanity in his characters, that they're beautiful looking technically, and and they're just so immersive in the experience that you're having, but somehow the characters just don't always connect with you as a viewer on a deep level. And I can see that.
Yeah, Nolan has at least his brother Jonah, who they have been working, I think, the last 2 or 3 films.
Yeah, it's because Nolan, the other Nolan's got his Westworld to contend with.
Yeah,
he's got a full-time job.
He was a person of interest. The guy's a TV tycoon. It's like, it makes sense. It's not that it was a fissure between the two of them that split them together, but apparently the word on the street, because a friend of mine went to Georgetown with Jonah Nolan, and so he would say that he was definitely the more human, more humorous.
Yeah.
It's that American accent, man. Christopher Nolan's faking the British accent.
I think he's faking the British accent.
All right. Well, anything else from the chat that we overlooked while we were ranting and raving?
No, I think we covered it. Well, John says not enough Piranha 2: The Spawning talk. I guess there was some.
I like Piranha 2,
but not nearly enough.
And I think, like I said, you can see the seeds of all the Cameron stuff to come. And even like Lance Henriksen's in there. I think Piranha 2 is unfairly maligned and overlooked. It is not as good as Aliens, not by my country mile, but it is worth a look.
It does make it makes you wonder if Cameron had the budget that he needed and had complete control of that movie. It could have been an incredible movie. Like you said, there's the first glimpse at his auteur filmmaking, but
even like an Escape from New York, you can see a little James Cameron in there with like some of the special effects work there. Like I love early Cameron. Or what is that early short that he did where you see some of the technology?
Xenogenesis. What's that? Xenogenesis? Something
That short's really insanely cool as well. I even like his music video that he did for Bill Paxton, which is like, very like late 80s biker gangs and all sorts of craziness going on. But for me, early Cameron is just it's where he was really firing on all cylinders. But when it comes to his collaborators, I got a question for both of you guys. James Horner has been a huge part of the James Cameron experience for so many of his movies, and really like the sound of a James Cameron movie and the music is quite distinctive. However, with The Abyss, you got Alan Silvestri instead. How do y'all think Alan Silvestri compares when it comes to creating that James Cameron flavor?
He started off with the Terminator with Brad Fiedel, who also came back for T2 and True Lies. So he worked with Brad for 3 films. He did James Horner for Aliens and Titanic and Avatar, and I'm assuming the 4 sequels will probably be James Horner as well for consistency. So he had this one other film with The Abyss with Alan Silvestri, who I think his previous film was Predator, and there are a lot of similarities, if you ask me, between the Predator score. And this. There's the military kind of snare drums, and there's just a lot of stuff in there that really feels quite similar. But I actually really like especially towards the end. I really like the sort of uplifting beats that he puts in when the alien craft lifts up out of the water, which first of all, I know it is supposed to be a craft based on the novelization, like a spaceship that came here a long time ago. In fact, the novel that Cameron worked on with the author,
Orson Scott Card.
Yeah, Orson Scott Card states that the mothership of these aliens actually resided on the dark side of the moon. So there was a lot more information.
Oh, interesting.
So you could see.
And Orson Scott Card obviously knows his way around sci-fi. He wrote Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead and a bunch of great sci-fi novels.
Exactly. So there's definitely more to the mythology that never made it to the final edit of the film that we saw, more of the backstory. I always just thought they were like a unique underwater civilization. When I first saw the movie, I never assumed they were extraterrestrial beings. I mean, who's to say what's living down there, right? We don't know anything about what's going on in the deepest trenches. And apparently, you sent us an interesting graphic to put some perspective on the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, that Cameron went to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and it shows sort of like how deep that is compared to where the Titanic was and other
versus like the Loch Ness or whatever.
Right, exactly. And it on this graph that you sent to us, on the very, very bottom in small print, it says the door that James Cameron discovered at the bottom, and he won't tell us what's inside it.
Well, hey, I'm seeing an interesting comment that's worth mentioning from Ryan Linder. He says, James is great, but what is the deal with his lighting setup? I totally agree that my lighting setup sucks. I basically have 2 desk lamps. I'm always a little self-conscious about being too well lit, but maybe I'm going too hard for like the Gordon Willis kind of doom and gloom. I like the idea of being in my cave with all my books and comics, but perhaps I could use a little more lighting on the scene. What do y'all think? Am I going for too dark a mystique with my videos?
I don't know. I like it because it's the same in day and night. I like the uniformity of the set design. Also, it makes you look like you're in one of those bathyspheres. You know, you're fighting Michael Biehn claw to claw.
This is the lighting that I would use if I was like playing D&D or reading a book or whatever. So this is kind of like my James Hancock lighting for media consumption. So it's an extension. This is not a set. This is my life.
While mine is the James Cameron blue lens filter.
I like it.
That
I'm on the Benthic Explorer. I'm topside with Chris Elliott. You know.
There you go.
So wait, you mentioned Horner. Yeah, I'm a Horner guy more than a Silvestri guy. As much as I like Silvestri's work, I think Horner's work is more. Horner sounds more like an acolyte of Jerry Goldsmith to me, almost pure, and it makes sense because if you listen
or John Williams, even more of that camp. Yeah.
Probably right. Yeah, probably even more right. If you listen to the score to Wrath of Khan, it has more cues, I think, coming off of Goldsmith's motion picture soundtrack, because why would you not? Those are all the cues were built in there. However, if you back to back the soundtracks for Aliens and Wrath of Khan, the cues, I mean, it's like he got paid twice for the same work. I love his work, and I like both those soundtracks. It's just they use a lot of the same cues. Yeah. The sort of metal on metal hits, that clang clang, clang clang, and the Klingon war horns, all that stuff is incredible, and they appear in both films. And I mean, as much as I couldn't tell you what Horner's score for like Legends of the Fall sounded like. He did a lot of work along the way that just are completely out of my purview. The stuff he did with Cameron was like indelible. That's like the stuff that got into my head when I was 12 years old will stick with me for the rest of my life.
Yeah. All right. Well, Bill, a question for you. Say I were 15, 16-year-old film freak, and I went and saw Avatar as a kid, had a blast, and recently saw Alita Battle Angel, thought it was tons of fun, but was totally new to this idea of James Cameron because in the 80s and 90s, he was a household name. He was just this giant filmmaker. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody was constantly talking about his movies. And I feel like 21st century film fans sometimes are almost dismissive and condescending when discussing him. Like, oh, all he ever does is give us Avatar announcements, but never actually delivers anything. Make the case for young film freaks out there, young television freaks out there, as to what the impact he made in the 80s and 90s was, but also what it was like as a young fan seeing these movies come out in real time.
Well, it was a golden age. If I see Aliens, I'm 11 years old in 86, that's a big deal. I mean, it scared the shit out of me. I mean, I had seen Aliens before Alien too, so Cameron's stab with the alien was the first one that hit me.
Same with me. I saw him, yeah.
I mean, that's just the way for a whole generation of people like us. But, I mean, it's easy to look back now and maybe get the feeling that what Cameron was somebody who really grew up on rubber monster suits and special effect matte paintings and trick photography and things like that, except that he had these gigantic, Wagnerian images in his head of what it could be. And Spielberg, to some degree, had the same thing too. And it's like, I don't know, it may be worth deciding, well, what's the difference between Spielberg and Cameron? Or at least, what do you think they think the difference is between each other? Because I bet you Cameron thinks he's got one competitor in the business, Spielberg. That's it. And I guess that they must be about 10 or 12, 15, maybe max years apart from each other in age. So they're generationally not too far apart.
And not to interrupt, but if you watch Cameron's show, I think about science fiction on the History Channel, he interviews Spielberg, and there's some tension there. You could just see it. It's very subtle, but you could just tell that there's some, there's like these two great giants in the world of sci-fi kind of comparing notes. But yeah, it's worth
comparing box office.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's like Cameron was taking like Corman and I'm not rehabilitating it, but deciding I'm going to do my own thing with it. This could be the greatest movies ever made. I could make my own version of David Lean, except it's going to be about a battleship underwater, and it's going to be about aliens who are blue. He's got this really lofty idea, and yet I still feel like it's a genre take. And in some ways, that's the thing that keeps me involved with Cameron, no matter how boring I might have found his last 2 or 3 films. Between Titanic and Avatar, there's really nothing there for me. other than achievement, other than the idea that you're watching a general marshal an army to battle, and somehow he holds it together. I can't complain about the end result other than the taste thing. He just makes these incredible films. So it's like if you were seeing him come of age, I think he's got these grand, lofty ambitions where he was never going to set out to make Barry Lyndon. He didn't have that in his bones, even though he may have thought to himself, I'm just as competent a filmmaker technically as Kubrick is. And he's never going to make Schindler's List because I just don't think he's got that in him. I mean, the closest he came to a Schindler's List was Titanic, and Titanic was still a technical exercise in filmmaking and scale and size and all those things. And fortitude, the kind of work that one man can take on his shoulders and carry a production through. I mean, if you're looking for the true Cameron, I really do think you got to see when no one was looking at him and they're looking at the work. That's why I think Terminator 1, Terminator 2, Aliens, and The Abyss, I think, are really representative of, and yeah, that's not that True Lies doesn't work, not that that's not representative, not that he hasn't made, those are most of his films there, essentially. But I think that he said more about himself without meaning to, and changed the business in doing so. And maybe that, to me, is going to be his golden era, where he was the almost most pristine, pure, undimmed by pessimism and or personal excess, if he's there now.
Well, and Spielberg had that 75 to 85 really was Spielberg's golden decade.
Perfect. Yeah.
A lot of sort of unevenness after that point. So,
well, you mentioned True Lies. I'm a big fan of True Lies. I don't like it as much as The Abyss, but it is enjoyable. But like The Abyss, True Lies and The Abyss are really friggin' difficult to get your hands on and actually see.
Yeah,
so, Adam, what can you tell us about the rumors, the mystique, or the all the various BS surrounding this possible 4K or 8K Abyss Blu-ray that might be coming away? Like, separate the fact from the fiction and
there's
to why we don't have these movies and when we might be seeing them.
So, first of all, Cameron has been teasing this for years now. I mean, I think when he first teased it when he was promoting the 3D release of T2 for the anniversary a few years ago. He first said, "Yeah, it's coming." But as recent as like a week ago, he actually responded to a tweet by none other than Rian Johnson and Ryan, what's his name, Deadpool,
Ryan Reynolds.
Ryan Reynolds. Yeah, I'm just brain fart. They were having some weird on Twitter conversation about why True Lies and The Abyss weren't available on Blu-ray, and Cameron responded to Ryan Reynolds saying, "It's on my to-do list, guys. Promise, I'm working on it." So he's well aware of the demand from not just us, geeks, but the celebrities and actors out there.
Also, just in terms of solidifying your legacy, if an entire generation can't see two of your best movies, it's not like he has some huge output. It's not like he has 50 movies to his name. He's got a handful of movies. So two of his best are very hard to find.
So the good thing is that they did announce about at the end of March, I would say, there was an article that the sound or sound mixer and color timer that has been working on this project did share something, a progress report saying that it's happening, or we're working on it. There hasn't, though, been any confirmation whether the special edition will be included. These are all open-ended questions, but I would imagine that it would have to be. At first, my initial fear was that the special edition being produced in 1992, that the effects were done in standard definition for a primarily standard definition market. But the fact that it did have a short-lived theatrical release means they must have done a negative cut, a final version on 35 millimeter that could stand up to a 4 or 8K scan. But my feeling is perhaps the visual effects didn't quite up-res properly, and that maybe they need to rework them a little bit to try to make them look exactly the same, but at a resolution that won't look pixelated at an 8K or.
But I feel like he's probably got 100,000 people on the payroll right now that could crank that shot out in an afternoon.
I know.
Like, how many crew members are working on these 4 Avatar sequels? I mean, just like somebody take a day off from Avatar and just finish friggin' The Abyss.
Well, Adam, I'm not a wonk like you, but especially about film. No, I mean that as a tribute to your skill set. But first of all, I saw the 35 mil print was shown at the Quad It was a shitty beat up print of the director's edition, special edition. That was November 2017. The Cohen Media Group, I think, owned a couple of prints of it. So it was a real treat, even if it was in bad shape, because I'd never seen the director's cut, in theater, but it was awesome. So I know there are definitely negative cuts of the thing out there. But the process, man, I looked into this when I was putting that video together, into seeing how far along it was. Like all things Cameron does, he is agonizingly slow. He has that. What was that? Who was Kubrick's guy from Filmmaker?
Leon Vitali.
Yeah. So he's got that like Leon Vitali type. I mean, I don't know if he's got anybody to do the actual work, but the idea of like scrutinizing the process and making sure, that's why he just can't get one of those 100,000s of people on the job, because Cameron's got to do it himself with his big fucking hard pig head. And the transfer that I saw, it was going to be a Wetgate AK transfer. And I had to go on YouTube to see what the fuck is a Wetgate transfer. And it's this painstaking thing where you're quite literally running the film through like a saline broth or something. Adam, have you ever seen this before?
Yeah, I have. A friend of mine owns a company that has one of those machines, and it's so slow, the process, frame by frame, to do these properly. And again, if you're doing an 8K or 6K, it's even slower. Which is smart to do, because then you don't have to do it again down the road when we get 8K.
Well, the human eye can't even like perceive that kind of resolution.
The only reason to do an 8K is for preservation purposes, to make sure that every little bit of information that was captured on that film is digitized and available for whatever reason. Like if you were to blow it up to an IMAX screen or something, that you could do it and not lose any.
So it doesn't look like your DVD on your TV the other night.
That's right. As I told them, I watched the special edition DVD from 2000. Now we're looking at this is almost 20 years ago, and DVD is a 25-year-old format, so it's a standard definition 720 by 480 resolution, blown up to nearly 4,000. In terms, horizontal picture. It's like a postage stamp, originally being blown up, and you just could see so much blocking, artifacting. It was painful to watch. And in a way, I'm hoping it doesn't come out too soon on Blu-ray now, because I'll want to watch it again. And I just spent 3 hours watching it on SD. So I need a little time before I can watch it again.
Yeah. Hey, a quick interruption. I need to offer a correction. Earlier, Steven Simpson, who's been very nice to hang out in the chat room this whole time, who's a massive film score buff. I referred to him as Stephen Thompson, who is a mixed martial arts fighter who fights in the welterweight division. So I don't know if it's like an insult to, but I did want to correct the name. But also, Steven Simpson, hunt him down on Twitter. He has a very cool podcast about gaming, and he was recently on Wrong Reel talking about film scores. So I just did want to offer that one quick correction as we start getting toward the kind of the closing stretch of this broadcast.
I did want to mention, just for the geeky people out there, one thing that, as I used to work for Apple, and I have a background in technology. I went to a technology school. And I wanted to just talk about the pseudopod and the technical aspects of it and what makes it so incredible, because they really did have to create software that didn't exist to make this. They had to build custom programming, and it revolutionized the industry, as we've said. It led to T2, which led to Jurassic Park. And again, watch Scurry's video, his essay, because it goes into all this as well. But it's only 75 seconds of screen time. And that 75 seconds is 16 different CG shots. So to create those 75 seconds, they had to do everything in a computer. Their entire computer system in ILM at the time had a maximum capacity of 900 megabytes. So they had to render these images for 75 seconds off 900 megabytes. I mean, this is like the first iPod that people bought back in 2003 had 5 gigabytes on it, and they had only 900 megabytes to do this entire sequence, 75-second sequence of the pseudopod
off an Apple II CI. Exactly.
Yeah, and another first for this film. It's the very first film in history to use the program Photoshop version 0.67. And it was the first film to ever, and it was one of the guys just said, let me try this new program called Photoshop. And it turned out to be an incredible tool for them. And since then, it's like one of the most important programs in the filmmaking and photography industries. So it really, on more ways than you can count, this film, even if you don't like the movie, you have to respect what it did for the industry.
Artistic result of those special effects shots are, for me, they work really well. Like the shot of the ship rising up out of the trench, and it's, you know, in contrast to the silhouette standing there, there's such an incredible sense of wonder. It's like, it's not on the level of like the little boy opening the door in Close Encounters and seeing all the lights, but it's getting pretty close. And I really think that's one of James Cameron's most iconic shots, of just this scientist, explorer, engineer, all suited up, standing on the edge of oblivion, and something totally otherworldly rises up before her. It's just absolutely killer. But then again, of course, just the pseudopod going through the ship, everybody's acting opposite some stupid like tube of like cardboard and socks, and they're like, oh my god, like with such awe and wonder on their faces. The actors do such a brilliant job of selling what they didn't really know, like really how it's going to turn out in the final film.
And they didn't know how to even do this, how to composite it. They had a guy on set take like thousands of high resolution, you know, camera photographs of every part of that set in those shots, so that they could stitch them together and put this, you know, this object, this CG creature on top of it. So it was just such a like a brave new, you know, bold new frontier that they were embarking on. And, you know, as Cameron said, though, in one of the interviews, if it didn't work, he could cut that scene out and it wouldn't really change the movie, the dramatic thrust of the film. It's an incredible scene, but it wouldn't make or break the movie. Come Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, if the CG didn't work in those films,
the movie would have collapsed like a house of cards.
Yeah.
All right, we have a quick question here from Adrian Mendoza. I remember hearing about this, but I don't quite know the full story. So what are your opinions on the T2 being re-edited and airbrushing Robert Patrick's genitals and replacing the stuntman's face to Arnie's face? Any strong feelings about, was that for the T2 3D re-release?
Yep, that's when they.
What's the deal with Robert Patrick's balls?
There's a short scene when he first appears in front of, you know, materializes.
That's right. You see a little newt sack hanging
down with one knee up. You remember he pulls the gun out and goes, you know, and cocks it. There is a like shadowy resemblance to what would be a, you know, his genitals,
his codpiece.
It's very hard to see, and it's kind of a pretty wide. Long
but in
shot.
8K, you never know. You could get some good details.
Yeah, and the other, so you know that was like unnecessary in my opinion. That who cares, unless Robert Patrick was very adamant that he not want his genitals to be seen anymore. But the other shot, it didn't really bother me. I always actually kind of hated the fact that I could tell that Schwarzenegger was not.
Is that for the bike stunt going off with the truck coming behind?
Right. With
no, you could totally tell it wasn't Arnie at the time.
It just was such a bad stunt double that anyone that watched it more than the first time, you saw it every time. The first time I didn't notice it because we're so enamored in the moment. Yeah. But at every viewing, every subsequent viewing, I'm like, oh, that's so not Arnold. So I don't mind that. They do it all the time now. They CG faces over, you know, other actors' bodies. So
and de-aging. When you see actors in their 50s and 60s looking like they're 30.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like, I love Nicole Kidman. So if she wants to be young and beautiful forever, go to it. I mean, and Aquaman, she looked like she was like 25.
You know what? To dial back for a second, when you were talking about actors responding to things that weren't on set, Metrograph here in New York City a couple of years ago had I forget which version of it, the Close Encounters, they were showing, I guess it's the director's cut, the extended edition. I forget what.
There's a couple of different competing versions floating.
Yeah, there's at least 3 of them. There was a TV cut, there's theatrical, but it was the one I think that is more or less regarded as the you know, the biggest cut, without the shitty ending where Dick Dreyfuss gets on the thing. Anyway, Bob Balaban was there, and he came in and he talked about it afterwards. This is great because, you know, Balaban lives in New York. I asked him a question. I said, I know for a fact that those puppets weren't done, you know, when you guys were shooting on the soundstage. It's like, how did you somehow respond to that? How did you generate this thing where you're looking with awe? I mean, Close Encounters is just filled with all these reverse shots of people standing with their jaws pretty much agape, slack. at something that, you know, and we know what they're looking at because we see the Carlo Rambaldi puppets and it's like earned. But getting actors to do that, to say it's like, hey guys, you got to trust me on this one. This thing where, you know, what'd you say, James? It was like a tube and some socks and some cardboard. Somehow, like, that's going to be a piece of majestic filmmaking that, you know, I guess we just have to dope into the camera right now, where we're all looking like this is something that we can't even imagine how beautiful this is, but it's like, it's going to pay off later on. Yeah, that is, you know, it's happened a few times. It used to happen with prosthetics and practical and optical stuff, but then doing it for special effects.
I mean, like Predator, removing Jean-Claude Van Damme from the film entirely and starting over from scratch.
But I mean, like, think about Natalie Portman reacting to a green guy holding a tennis ball over his head in all those prequel movies. And it's like, you saw it done badly, you saw it done well. The difference in doing it well is night and day. And granted, they weren't bored by responding to things that weren't there. So it was easier to sell those actors on a novelty. So watching Ed Harris, and I was going to say at the end of the movie too, because we haven't really talked about the, you know, the spaceship sequence where Ed Harris is inside the 2 walls of water watching the transmissions. I had, for some reason, thought that those jellyfish, you know, aliens were also CG, but those were all practical as well. They actually made these big gooey puppets that they put on the set. It's like, oh, that's awesome too. So you have this movie where Ed Harris is actually able to respond. You know, like, the amount of practical stuff they did on this was also insane, in addition to, you know, really inventing visual effects at the same time. But
it was this time when, I love it because it was this time when they were doing breakthroughs with CG effects, but they were implementing every other type of special effect technique known at that point as well, whether it was miniature submersibles or, you know, the Benthic Explorer was a giant, like, 45-foot model that they were, you know, I never knew that. It was so good, right?
It's perfect.
It looked like a real thing.
Yeah.
But that's just a great example, all the way through to like Jurassic Park, where it was a mixture of CG and animatronic and life-size dinosaurs. Like, they just, depending on the shot, they did what they had to do. And I like that. I feel like that's a much more challenging, but much more, it delivers the goods better than today, where they just go with, oh, we'll fix it in post. We'll do it all in post. We'll make everything CG after the fact. And to me, that, yes, maybe it has some, there's a uniformity to it as a result, but if it's not, though, usually uniform, because most of these big blockbuster movies, including the Marvel ones, they farm out the work to like 7 different special effects houses, and it doesn't always look good. You know, it's not always consistent, and that's something that always bothered me, at least, with the full CG movies that are out today.
Mm-hmm. Hey, I'm just taking a quick notice in the chat. We've got both Sky Wingfield is back, as well as the great Martin Kessler. Check out his podcast, Flixwise Canada, which he's been nice enough to have me on. And he's also on the most recent episode of Wrong Reel, talking about Valerian Borovchik, which is quite a different topic from James Cameron. But if you have a taste for, if you're broad-minded and seek outrageous entertainment, then definitely hunt down the films of Valerian Borovchik. But shout out to all those guys in the chat who have been so loyal to come back on Wrong Reel so many times.
Adam, did you see the Robert Rodriguez movie? I forget if that had come up here.
Oh, Alita Battle Angel?
Yeah.
I saw it up at the 42nd Street AMC, and the special effects were, you had to sweep my jaw off the floor after the film.
Right. Yeah, I tried to go twice, but like things conspired against me. I have a 5-year-old, and my wife is a film editor, so she works crazy hours. She doesn't work for James Cameron, but she has edited for Brett Ratner and for Michael Bay for commercials that they've directed.
Some of the most horrible men in the business.
Exactly. So I sympathize with her. But anyway, I'm constantly doing the the daddy daycare in the evening, so it's getting harder and harder for me to get out to a movie, unless it's a kids movie, which frankly most of them are horrible. So
well, that was my
when they're good, they're good. You know.
Yeah, my question was kind of about, because I'm sure that, I don't know how much, I didn't see it, but James, I did watch your review, so I think that makes me an expert on the topic. I wonder how much of that was Cameron, how much of that was Rodriguez, and if it's a clue in terms of what kind of filmmaking you are going to get, whether it's technical competency, and not only that, but one of the pitfalls of a guy like Cameron, to me, especially if I've already seen him dancing on that razor thin line between humanity and ice cold technician. if you rely on doing everything in post more and more, I feel like you get away from the tenuous hold that he had on human chemistry to begin with. So if he is going to take work and farm it out and do blue people and just assume that you don't need anything, you don't need practicals, you can just do everything with stereoscopic cameras and actors just pretending, that there's eye lines on set. I think that augurs pretty grimly for a guy who, isn't necessarily prospering the further he gets away from.
Who do you think gets it right when it comes to motion capture and the humanity of the characters? Because obviously there are a lot of people out there like Andy Serkis who are, on the vanguard of this kind of technology. Like, who right now is a filmmaker and or performer technician who you feel like finds the heart within all this technique?
Well, I thought that a revelation was Matt Reeves's Rise of the Planet of the Apes. That was the second one. That movie was just fucking. It's untalked about.
Because Dawn, Rise. Well,
War.
Yeah, the Dawn and Rise thing was such a stupid, short-sightedness on that.
But Rise is incredible, and I think that Ape trilogy. It's like, I didn't love the third one as much as, but the third one had some incredible performances. But that second one, the synthesis between Andy Serkis as an actor, Andy Serkis as a consultant, and Matt Reeves as apparently a listening, hungry filmmaker who wanted to put his stamp on something. I don't know why we're not talking about it today, because I think that Apes trilogy is great. I think that is the Dark Knight of that Apes trilogy. They did things with performance and motion capture that no one else has ever done. And the thing is, it wasn't just Andy Serkis, because Toby Kebbell, who is otherwise an undistinguished actor in Hollywood, he played Doctor Doom in the Fantastic Four fracas, the imbroglio.
Josh Tranks.
Josh Tranks, yeah, exactly.
He was the guy from Ben-Hur.
And he was,
and he gets raped by Val Kilmer and Alexander.
Oh, he is pretty, but he did it
in a Black Mirror episode.
The complete history of us. Yeah. But he did an incredible job as the bad guy, Koba, and it's like you didn't just have one fluky actor who is an opsomath at doing motion capture like Serkis. You had two or three, and Steve Zahn did a great job in War. On top of that, so you could go back to I think. Jackson hasn't necessarily comported himself well after the original, 3 Lord of the Rings movies, but those
Mortal Engines is the definition of every problem you're describing about the absence of heart and humanity and soul amidst all this special effects nonsense. And it's like that's a bunch of technique in search of a story.
Yeah. I just saw Frighteners for the first time at Alamo a couple of days ago, and I'd never, I'd never seen it before, and I was like holding on to it, like, I'm sure this is gonna, this is gonna redeem itself. And it didn't pay off, and I just didn't enjoy it. It has
fun bits, but it's uneven. It's not nearly as good as like his early '90s Bananas flicks.
Did they screen the director's cut version or the original theatrical? I'm just curious because
a good question. I think it was theatrical. I don't think it was director's cut.
There is a director's cut that's on Blu-ray that I found to be a modestly better version of the movie.
Yeah, y'all are getting me excited about a possible live stream of the rise and fall of Peter Jackson. Yeah, because there was a period where he was my favorite filmmaker, one of my favorite filmmakers in the world, like right around the time of like Return of the King coming out. I was like, this guy, he can do everything. He can do Meet the Feebles. He can do
Heavenly Creatures.
He can do Heavenly Creatures, like art film, crazy puppets, gore, splatterfest, fake documentaries like Forgotten Silver. Like I was like, he is the most versatile, crazy, creative guy alive. And now I outright hate him. Like despise his films. I'm like openly antagonistic, but you never know what the future might hold, because that World War I restoration documentary.
Fantastic. It was one of my favorite movies of last year.
Yeah. So maybe Peter Jackson's going to rise again.
I think I'm the one person, and you'll hate me for it, that actually had fun watching the Hobbit films, not as an adaptation, not as an adaptation of the Hobbit, because I love the book, but I just love being immersed in the world of Middle Earth, and I look at it as its own thing, its separate thing. And if you didn't know anything about Middle Earth or The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, I think people would view those films very differently. They're just sword and sorcery epics, and it's because of our preconceived notion of what it should be. And I get that it's not what it should be, but if you can separate yourself from that,
give me the Rankin Bass cartoon.
Yeah.
Any day.
That's a far better interpretation of the book, no question. But I enjoyed them. Once I realized it wasn't going to be faithful in any way, and it wasn't going to be a proper adaptation of the book I so loved, I just sort of distanced myself from it and just gotta let it happen. Kind of let.
Stop with the kicking. I know that we're getting away from Cameron here, but it made me think. You mentioned Jackson. This is the thing I've stuck with Jackson for a while, because around the time they were cooking up The Hobbit, Guillermo del Toro was originally supposed to be the guy doing it, and they were
fresh off Pan's Labyrinth, and
they were co-conspirating on co-conspiratoring. I don't know what the term is. On
Co-conspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, they were talking about doing Pacific Rim and Hobbit. They were all happening at the same time. And the thing is that it almost unfortunately went the way you would have expected, where Peter Jackson decided to do the Hobbit movies and Del Toro winds up doing Pacific Rim, and it's like, actually, I don't like either of those movies. I really don't like Pacific Rim. I think it's just a bomb to me. It's just boring.
Battle of Hong Kong's fun, but that's like
a little bit. But it's like, what would it have been like creatively as an experiment if they had flopped and each of them had made the other's pictures? And it's like, give me Del Toro Hobbit, give me Peter Jackson Pacific Rim, then I think we're having a different conversation.
If Del Toro Hobbit had the imagination and like the soaring ambition of Pan's Labyrinth, it would have been a remarkable achievement.
But it's like Jackson had nothing new to say about Middle Earth, and it's like, well, he started it, but give it to Del Toro to take over and add his own thing. So far, we haven't seen any other directors
make it a movie. You don't need 9 hours of filler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's another topic for another day. So as we start drawing things down to a close, I just want to give you a chance to plug, promote anything you're working on, your social media. We'll start with you, Adam. Thanks also for the awesome thumbnails, and thanks for being such an amazing guest. And we'll definitely have to do more of these. But where can people find the great Adam Rackoff if they want to talk more?
Well, I don't know where they can find the great Adam Rackoff, but you can find me at Twitter, on Twitter, at Adam Rackoff, all one word. No hyphens, no underscores. That's my only social media presence. So feel free to, if you want to follow me, I try to follow everybody back if I remember to do so. So
beautiful.
We can continue any of this discussion offline.
Excellent. And Mr. Scurry, where can people find the wonderful things you're doing these days, both on YouTube and iTunes?
Now with more Scurry, believe me. Yeah. So I'm at William Scurry on Twitter. I'm there all the goddamn time. We're having a good time. We continue this over there, and all you guys know that because you're pretty much, like I say, guys, you know what I mean, gender neutral. We have a good time on Twitter.
We are all unsullied on this channel.
Look at my gray worm, everybody. Yeah, and so my podcast is I Don't Get It. At Noah and Bill's show. Follow that. I do Daily Cobra Commander 6 days a week, every morning about 8 a.m. that pops up. I show up on different podcasts. In fact, I believe I'm scheduled to show up in Cardiff relatively soon on an undisclosed top secret project out of Wales too.
Very nice. Well, once again, just a huge shout out to everybody on the channel, like whether it's The Pink Smoke with John Cribbs or Flixwise Canada or Film 89 or, Steven Simpson. I am blanking on the name of his podcast. I've got it right here. Steven Simpson, his podcast is Pop Culture Gamers. So everybody who showed up, we can't thank you enough for the support. And if people, my podcast is now playing on my iPad. But if you want to subscribe, that would be awesome. And if you want to hit the like button, that's always very helpful. And you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax. And coming up, I've got a couple different live streams that I would like to do. Nothing concrete, but the goal is to start doing these once a week and then slowly expand from there. But can't thank you enough for all the support. Thanks for the super chat donations. And we'll be back at y'all in the near future. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards. Boom.